Hi everyone, and welcome to our panel session this afternoon in Brisbane time. I know you're coming to us from all around the world, and I'm really excited today because we've got an international panel here with us today from all around the world. We're covering off on many different regions. And today in this panel session, we're going to be talking about shaping the next new normal in tourism, hospitality and events, and really bring you an international perspective. So I do encourage you to engage in the panel today. We will be using the Q&A function within the conference platform. So if you have comments or you'd like to ask a question of our panelists, if you could please pop those in the chat. I'd first of all like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I'm meeting on today, which is the Yugambeh people, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. I thought we'd get started today by asking participants what's changed in their area in terms of the tourism, hospitality and events area, and what is the new normal in wherever they're coming to us from today. So we've got people from all around the world, so it'd be quite interesting just in the Q&A function if there's certain things that you think have changed. Some of the things that I'm noticing, will minibars return to the room after the pandemic? Even small things like that. Has self-service check-in become the next new normal? And will domestic tourism continue to boom once the international borders open? So lots of big picture questions. Some of them may be similar in different parts of the world, but some of the different regions may be experiencing things very differently. So welcome today. My name is Associate Professor Sarah Gardiner. I'm the Acting Director of the Griffith Institute for Tourism. And I thank you for joining our panel today. We have 4 excellent international panelists that have come with us today, and really excited to hear the international perspectives. I'd first like to introduce Dr. Pauline Sheldon, who is a Professor Emerita at the University of Hawaii School of Tourism Industry Management. Pauline is a leading academic, and I'm sure many of you already are familiar with Pauline's work and know her from previous conferences. I'm particularly interested to hear her thoughts today because she's very much involved with the Hawaiian tourism industry, and that's one industry I've really been keeping an eye on throughout this pandemic. Such an interesting case study in how they've navigated the pandemic. So welcome, Pauline. Thank you for joining us today. Our second panelist is Wattanacharoensil. I've mucked up that name, but I'll get you to introduce yourself, from the Walanchalee University in Thailand, and she is the chairperson of Education and Research Group at the destination Megong. She also brings us insights and the impact and recovery plan from a Thailand perspective, and what is the new normal in Asia. So welcome. We've also got Dr. Sérgio Guerreiro, who is the current chairman of the OECD Tourism Committee. He's the chairman of the European Travel Commission's Market Intelligence Group and an adjunct professor at Nova School of Business and Economics. We're particularly interested to hear his views on the new normal in Europe, and he brings a mix of academic and industry perspectives to this panel session. So welcome, Sérgio. And then we have Fatima. Alloghani is currently the head of emeritus strategy at Dubai Commercial Bank. However, today she will address you and this panel topic based upon her previous experience working at Expo Dubai as the head of the Expo Academy. So welcome. And we are particularly interested to hear about the impacts of the pandemic on World Expo Dubai and the new normal in the Middle East region. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. So hopefully you started to post your ideas around the next new normal in your region that you're joining us from today, and anything you've noticed in terms of the new normal in tourism globally in the Q&A, and we'll come back to that. So to get started today, I'm going to call upon Pauline to speak first. Each of our panelists will talk for about 5 minutes just to bring their insights from their area or region that they come from and the different backgrounds that they come from. We also have someone online today, a very special person, Jimmy, and he has actually been engaged to do a graphic recording of our discussion today. And during the panel session, we will be throwing to Jimmy at various points. He'll do a visual summary of the panel session, so that'll be really interesting as well. So we thought, since our panelists come from different parts of the world, we thought what would be really interesting to get the conversation started is for them just to reflect on how the pandemic has actually impacted on their region, and what are some of the key challenges for their region moving forward and the global tourism industry as we adjust to this next new normal. So I'm going to call on Pauline to speak first. Welcome, Pauline. If you could please unmute your mic, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to the Corthy organizers for inviting me to be part of this very exciting panel. And aloha from across the Pacific. Okay, so, the last 2 years in Hawaii tourism have been extremely transformative. And they began with 3 events right at the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020. The end of 2019, our numbers of tourists were just over the roof. We had over 10 million. We didn't know what to do with ourselves. All the residents were saying these islands are being run for tourists and not for us. And that's where we were at the end of 2019. The beginning of 2020, the Hawaii Tourism Authority embraced a new strategic plan, a 6-year strategic plan that was very, very far-reaching, innovative, and enlightened. It had 4 pillars about community involvement, culture, environmental stewardship, and brand marketing. But this strategic plan on paper looked good, but it didn't really have the meat and the energy to move it forward until they hired a new CEO for the Hawaii Tourism Authority by the name of John DeFries. And once he came on board, this plan took wings. I don't know if any of you know about John DeFries. He's a native Hawaiian elder. He was born in Waikiki when Waikiki was still a pig farm before they built any hotels. And he embraces the native Hawaiian culture so deeply and so completely. And he is now driving the HTA's movement forward with that strategic plan. The plan is definitely regenerative in nature. And I would have to say that when we look into a lot of indigenous cultures, including the Hawaiian culture, we see values that really are exactly what regeneration is all about. So, we were off to a really great start. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and we went through the whiplash that every destination went through, where we had no tourists, basically. And during that time, all the residents began to enjoy the beaches and really said, hi, it's a great place we live when there's no tourists, right? And then after that, we got the concern about the economy. And last summer, we went through a lot of discounting of hotels and airlines, and we were bombarded with tourists. And it was just really overwhelming, not only in size, but in terms of quality. The people who were coming did not respect the land. One of the images that I recall from that time, where all the residents were so rather disgruntled, was one of our endangered Hawaiian monk seals being basically harassed by tourists trying to get a photograph with them. And it was just the epitome of disrespect. So anyway, we now are still moving forward with the strategic plan with John's leadership, and all of the native Hawaiian values of kuleana, malama. Malama is the one that we're using most to drive our movement forward out of the pandemic. And malama means respect, respect for the land, for the tourists, for the residents. And so malama, you'll hear me talk about as I go through a few more comments here. So with that in place, we are moving forward. We have 4 challenges I'd just like to briefly touch on. I can go into more detail later, but the first challenge that we're facing is, of course, volume, the volume versus value question, right? We have the aggregate volume question, where we don't want to go back to 10 million. What the right number is, we don't know, but what we do know is that the difference between the 7 million that we could sort of kind of live with to the 10 million that we decided we couldn't live with, where were they all staying? They were staying in many cases, illegal short-term rentals. And so right now, the legislator is looking to bring in some legislation to drastically reduce that, which we hope will reduce the volume. We also have the issue of volume at the key sites where everybody wants to go, whether it's Hanauma Bay or the Diamond Head Trail or whatever. And now we're putting in reservation systems, and we're also putting in fees as well. So that's a little bit of an attempt to deal with the volume issue. We're also working hard to keep the community on each of the islands heavily engaged with the decision-making going forward. One thing HTA did put in place at the beginning of the pandemic was something, there were very, very in-depth community conversations. They were called DMACs, Destination Management Action Plans, trying to get the pulse of what the residents in each of the areas around the islands wanted. And they are driving the plans going forward. So keeping the community engaged, I think, is one thing we're working on. Another thing we're working on is designing experiences to encourage visitor behavior that we feel, is in line with our regenerative plan of Malama and Kuleana and so on. How are we doing this? Well, Malama Hawaii initiated a program where some of the hotels and so on would give perhaps a free night or restaurants a free meal, something like that, if the visitor engaged in one of the volunteer programs or in some way engaged with the culture or the environment of Hawaii. This is an ongoing program. It's still developing, but I think it has a lot of promise. The other thing that we're working on is still a challenge is, of course, to encourage the private sector to embrace the sustainable and regenerative principles and values and try to drop the short-term profit, short-term bottom line motive that's driving their activity. And to do that, one of the things we're doing, there's a very wonderful organization in Hawaii called Hawaii Green Growth. I'm on the board of that. And they have had for a number of years a sustainability business forum where the businesses come together across the economy talking about ways that they can embrace the sustainable development goals in their businesses more and more. Initially, there were only 2 or 3 tourism businesses as part of that. So we're about to launch the Sustainable Tourism Forum to build the networking, to have the conversations so that the private sector can also embrace the regenerative movement forward that is so in line with the native Hawaiian culture. I think that's about 5 minutes. I'll stop there and we can go into some more detail later on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pauline. That was amazing. I've been watching Hawaii with interest because it is obviously one of the destinations that perhaps suffers a little bit from over-tourism or large volume tourism, and has been quite innovative in terms of its response to the pandemic. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to call on Assistant Professor Wattanacharoensil, and she can bring us some insights from Thailand and what's happening in that neck of the woods.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much as well for the Quartet organizer for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. It's my honor to be here speaking with the Quartet conference today. For Thailand, I think it's, as well as many other regions, Thailand and some other countries in the Southeast Asian countries, we have been experiencing a sharp drop of international tourist arrival. And obviously that badly affected the economies, especially to those countries that relied and depend so much on the tourism sector. Let me give you some ideas that Thailand, for example, is one of those countries. We have about 20% of the tourism sector contributed into the country's GDP. And this 20% of the total contribution is a large amount. And the same amount is also found as well in the countries like Cambodia or the Philippines. So because of that, tourism is a large income generator for our countries. And so when we have the impact of the COVID-19, it's definitely affect a lot of the livelihood and well-being for these people who are doing the tourism business. Just to give you into a clearer picture, in year 2019, Thailand as a country, we welcomed about 40 million international tourist arrival. It was the year that we hit, a high, the highest growth in terms of tourism in number. But then in year 2020, after the COVID-19 hit, the number has been declining down to more than 80%. And this 80% is the average number of declines, as well as many other countries in the region. So instead of welcoming 40 million tourists, we ended up having about 6.7 million tourists coming into the country. And then we thought it was already bad, but not until 2021 that we end up, we really hit our rock bottom. Our international arrival turned out to be less than 1 million. I think it was around 700 million international tourists. So that's badly affected the economy, and definitely it destroys a lot of small tourism business in that particular time. So because of that, we tend to have a lot of problems in terms of creating the resilience into those tourism's small business in the country. Now, having said that, even though things seems to be, quite badly affected in terms of economy. But admittedly, we have to accept that during the time of 2019, when we got about 40 million international tourists, it really exceeded the country's carrying capacity. So we took a heavy toll on our natural resources, the environment. So a lot of this has been, happening as a negative effect. So during the COVID period, that was a time when we could see that a lot of nature restorations, that we have more of the revival biodiversity within the country. Like we found and we experienced that some of the endangered species started to come back, and bred their populations. Like for example, we have one of the very special species of green turtle that never lay egg for the past 4 years, and they just came back to lay egg during the COVID period. So that was, the positive effect that we have. And in terms of the policy-wise, we could also experience as well that the government also take this opportunity as a time to try to strike for a balance between the short and the long-term gain toward the sustainable tourism, and especially during the COVID-19 recovery. We see some of the policies coming about that put in as our national strategic agenda. Like for example, the government introduced the concept called BCG economy, that stands for biodiversity, green and circular economy. And of course, tourism industry has also been included as part of the driver of this economy as well. We start seeing the government put more campaigns fighting towards the climate change. We now having the campaigns called neutral carbon tourism. And of course, a lot more of the research funding has also been given by the government as well. And then we start seeing the initiative of resegmentation of tourists. Before, of course, we welcome too many international tourists coming in the country, but now we are going to move to the quality tourists, like Professor Pauline mentioned before. So now we start developing a new type of tourism products that creates more value, but reduce, more of the quantity or the numbers of tourists. So we start looking into positioning the destinations to be health and wellness destinations, and also trying to find some more of the tourism product and segmentations that allow us to capture more of the quality of tourists, so that we can ensure that tourism industry can help, bring up the revenues. Because after all, the details in here is for a lot of countries in the Southeast Asia, tourism development and tourism industries are still very important tools for the poverty elevation. So that's why we also have to, bring this in mind. Am I over the 5 minutes already? Can I just add a little bit more point in here, or? Okay, thank you very much. I think this is one of the key challenges that the government is trying to do, and as well as Professor Pauline also mentioned as well. Now we have seen this putting in the paper. We see a lot of movements coming about as well, but whether how it is going to really bring the positive effect, especially in terms of the environmental protections, in terms of promoting more of the neutral carbon tourism, changing the behavior of tourists, that's still a long way to see, because we also need to have a constant actions in order to make this happen. I think this is all about it I would like to share for now, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's really, really interesting, and we'll definitely a lot of food for thought there, and we'll have lots of discussion about that as we move forward. I might then call on Sérgio to provide us with a bit of a perspective from Europe and give us a bit of an insight as to what's happened there and potentially the new normal in Europe.
Well, hello everyone. It's a pleasure. Well, thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this event. I would love to be in Australia, to be honest, but things are now opening at last. Well, a little bit of overview on Europe. Well, Europe is the number one region in terms of tourism in the world, in terms of tourism arrivals. And we lived like a roller coaster in these last 2 years, and actually the international arrivals in Europe decreased almost 70% in 2020, but grew actually in 2021. But we're still 63% of the volume that we had in 2019. And what we've seen within Europe was actually an uneven recovery around the regions. We had, for example, the South Mediterranean Europe grew 57% in 2021. So basically almost recovering half of the volume that they had in 2019. But if you go to Northern Europe, we're just minus 84% of where we were in 2019. So recovery was pretty much uneven, and that is, I would say, correlated with three elements. I would say, first of all, the dependence on tourism, and the countries that have a higher dependence on tourism, like Spain, like Croatia, like Montenegro, like Iceland, or Portugal, or Greece, suffered significantly in terms of arrivals, but at the same time, in terms of GDP, because all these countries, tourism represents from 8 to 12% of their GDP. So 2020 was a very, very tough year in terms of the whole economy. At the same time, what we've suffered is this uneven impact is also correlated with the dependence of long-haul markets, because what happened is, when we're talking about US, Canada, and China, which are the main long-haul markets for Europe, they basically locked down in 2020, and only in half of 2021 started to recover in the cases of US and Canada. But the China, for example, it's still case. In a country that I come from, Portugal, where our fifth market is Brazil, and all these three long-haul markets, just to give you an example, were the ones actually making our way for recovery in recent years. They were the ones growing in a more steady way, and were also the ones that were feeding our strategy in terms of reducing seasonality and replacing, like Pauline was saying, replacing a little bit volume for quality. And what happened is, with all this, and we were reducing our seasonality rate in the last 5 years, what happened basically is we got stuck with the traditional markets, which are more seasonal. Last point on this uneven growth is connected to the role of the domestic market, and I believe here this was one of the very important things for explaining behavior in Europe. Why? Because our domestic market within Europe is pretty much strong. And at the same time, in some countries, like you go to France, you go to Italy, you go to Spain, and so on, the domestic market is so big that they almost compensated the decrease that we had in international market. And I believe this is a very interesting thing for the transformation of the sector that we are aiming. Three elements of this recovery. First of all, the need for adaptation. I think it was a pretty much difficult year for anyone in the business. So adapting to rules, adapting to the fact that, yeah, we have no business and we have to have the anxiety of following, and it was a bit of a crazy thing, always following who's opening, who's not opening, what are the next rules. So I think management was pretty much impacted here. The second one was the role of the government, and here the ones that discussed destination management. This was a very interesting year to understand actually the ability of governments to put in place destination management, and here support, financial support from governments to businesses and jobs were fundamental to keep the industry alive, and this was a very positive thing. The third point that I would like to mention is also digital, the transformation process. First one, digital. I think digital got in the businesses in a very positive way. Second one, sustainability didn't get out of the agenda, and those are excellent news, but also a responsibility for the sector. And third point, the role of the community, because I think for the first time that I see governments and industry work pretty much together. A bit on key challenges for the future, I highlighted three big areas. The first one, well, understanding, and this is a pitch that I always do because you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. We are now living an opening process in Europe and a release of restrictions, but actually the health-related issues will be here for the future. So how do we control pandemic and vaccination processes has been very important here. How are we going to deal with easy of restrictions? Are we going to put it in place permanently or not? And the third point, which also is connected to destination management, is how do we provide clear information on restrictions to both businesses and tourists. And this was a very important thing. I think one of the most important lessons to learn from this period was our inability in sometimes to provide this well. The second point that I would like to mention as key challenges is the ability to deal with transformation drivers. And here, technology played an important role here. We all hear about digital menus, chatbots, or online communication, but it's here to stay. And we are just in the beginning of the digital transformation for the sector. The second point is connected to this, is actually our ability to use this digital transformation and the data that comes from to better manage, to better design new business models, and to better know our consumers. Third point here, sustainability is definitely part of the agenda. It's a huge responsibility for the sector. And remember that in 2019, all of us around the table, and some of you mentioned also, we were discussing over-tourism. If we don't change anything, over-tourism will come in the short term, and we're going to deal, I would say, even with the worst problem that we had in 2019. So it's time for innovation to how to spread tourists around, how to better manage this. And the last point, which is something that at OECD level, everyone is talking about, is a very serious question, which is the attractiveness of the tourism sector for talent. We lost millions of employees during this period, and all the discussions that we're having at policy level are talking about how hard it is to bring people back. And if we don't have people back, we have a huge transformation within the industry that we have to deal with. So I don't know if I took my 5 minutes, but it's my pitch here. Thank you.
Yeah. So interesting to see the contrast of Sorry, I think I just was muted there for a moment. It's so interesting to see the contrast of experiences between Hawaii, Thailand, and the US. And particularly, I think this question, not just around what happened during the pandemic, but how we actually reopen, we can explore as part of the discussion. We do have a fourth panelist in the session, Fatima, and you also have a presentation that you'd like to share with us. So I might just get you to share your screen now. Particularly interested in the World Expo in Dubai and what's happening in the Middle East in terms of the pandemic and the next new normal.
Oh, thank you. Panel chair, fellow panelists, and distinguished guests, thank you very much for giving me such an opportunity. My name is Fatima Alloghani. I look after Emiratization, which is basically engaging national youth in terms of taking charge and development of the entire country. So if I wasn't at the Expo 2020, probably I wouldn't be able to participate in this conference, and simply because it gave me insights about tourism and about how an event like Expo 2020 could really thrive in such a time. To be honest with you, and compared to my fellow panelists, probably I'm the less experienced when it comes to tourism, but I will share with you something from the heart of Dubai and the UAE as a citizen myself who witnessed it for the first time. At the beginning, allow me to share this slide, and simple, just to share with you the outline of what I wanted to restrict myself to 5 minutes, and hope so. It's such an interesting subject, and it's very difficult to sum it in such a short time. But having said that, allow me to start with the Expo 2020. Of course, when we were hit by the pandemic, an international event, a pride of the nation, of a country like a small nation like the UAE was hit. And we were waiting to see how the BIE, the Bureau of International Exposition, would approve our 1-year delay, and we got that granted at April. And we opened our doors for October 2022 instead of October 2021, and the Expo is still happening as we go. But all that took a great amount of effort, especially from leadership. When we talk about the Expo, we're extremely lucky because our managing director happens to be a minister, an extremely well-connected and versatile one. And therefore, the steering and the changes and the updates and the directions and how close premises she was with us, especially with her weekly updates and also how careful she was. I remember she implied that all the staff should be vaccinated before the Expo starts. She always deployed her human tact before even business. So that's something I really, really admire. I'm very proud to say that today we recorded 11 million visits in 4 months, and we still have another a month and a half to go. One of the main things that really made Dubai and made the UAE probably stand out when it comes to recovering from the pandemic is how unified command, starting from the leadership all the way, pulling government and private sectors and private healthcare providers, our connectivity with the internal national agenda and external connection with international bodies like the World Health Organization really helped us to pull our efforts together and learn in our first fight to the pandemic. But to cut it really, really short, regardless of all these leadership and stakeholders engagement and synchronization, I think I will give the main reason or the main stake is to one city, one community, because regardless of the strength of the leadership and the union, I think we managed to get to pull one city and one community aspect apart from it being people adhering to disciplines and being updated and following procedures and really, really trusting the commands instead of opposing the changes that imposed on them from time to time. And I wanted to also share with you some of the hashtags that people from this part of the world experienced throughout the pandemic. Stay home, stay safe at the beginning, and then please follow the rules. We are all responsible, abiding nations because of the tremendous result we got in terms of our alignment and following, and recently together we recover. With that, I also wanted to share with you that the UAE released last year a stimulus package of 7 billion AED dirhams for tourism to boost tourism and trade. And we were lucky enough to register over 7 million visitors in 2021. The interesting part is there were a trade or hotels focus on domestic tourism and called for in-house citizens and residents to come and enjoy hotels. And that gave us a remark of 81% hotels occupancy, which is versus before the pandemic, it is considered higher. And the reason why we're very confident in opening for tourism, and especially when it comes to facilitating visitations and opening our airlines and the city, it's all relevant to, probably related to the 94% vaccinated record. I'm very glad also to disclose that recently we were, or UAE were announced as a #1 in resilience ranking when it comes to Bloomberg. And with that, I just wanted to conclude, and we'll be happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you so much, Fatima. So we're just seeing if you do have questions or you'd like to post a thought in the chat, if you just go to the Q&A as part of the conference website, and you can, the chat's actually disabled or through the Zoom, but you can use the Q&A function on the website. We have had a question come through from Aaron Tham related to community sentiment. And I noticed a few of you made these points around this idea of reopening and potentially negative sentiment towards tourism, maybe because of over-tourism, but also we've seen sort of anti-tourism protests in Europe and so forth. So thinking moving forward, as we move out of this pandemic, hopefully, will we see some differences in terms of how people react to tourism? I know I might call on you, Pauline, to start with, because I know I have been following, you mentioned that snorkel site near Hawaii that was receiving about 4,000 visitors a day and having to close certain days because of sort of the over-tourism of the site. Now I think they've reduced it down to about 1,000 visitors a day. Will it go back to 4,000, or do you think it's going to stay at 1,000? And how do people in
I think we're going to see more and more of these kinds of restrictions, Sarah. I don't think we're going to go back. The sentiment here is so very strong. And I think, you know, because we now have leadership that is listening to what the residents want, they can't go back on that. And so it's just about getting the right balance, you know. So I see moving forward as part of any regenerative tourism plan, the community has to be there have to be conversations going on constantly with the community. It's not any more token like it used to be. You know, we'll have a community meeting, see what they think, and we'll go do our own thing. No, it has to be genuine. It has to be ongoing. It has to be, you know, a listening at a level that has not happened before. And we are starting to see that here. And it's very, very heartwarming. So I would say, no, we will not go back. Not in Hawaii.
It was interesting. I was in a concurrent session earlier today around cruise tourism. So I think that's a real challenge moving forward. Sérgio, I wanted to ask you, because you made an important point, and I think it's pertinent in Australia, but in other parts of the world as well. We've had very different policies between our different states of Australia in terms of our restrictions and the rules around travel and how you can move and what you can do. I imagine a similar sort of case in Europe, and sitting in the southern hemisphere down here. I don't know much. If I had to travel to, I don't know the difference between going to Germany or France or heading over to Portugal. Are there a whole lot of different rules, and how does a visitor navigate that as they move back to sort of this global travel?
Well, that's an excellent question. But let me just add something to what Pauline was saying.
Sure.
I come from Portugal, and then in Portugal, we are, since before pandemic, we seriously believe that residents have to be part of the equation. We've designed our strategy in 2017, doing more than 50 sessions discussing our strategy with the residents. And they are a very important part of the equation. Otherwise, we will see movements like we've seen in some parts of Europe against tourism, fighting against, and having residents explicitly being against tourists. That's something that we cannot go back, especially because with this pandemic, we owned our destination like never before. So I think that's something that we'll say for the future, and I believe that any strategy for the future will have to have residents as part of the equation for sure. So that was my first point. And on the restrictions and on the information, that was, I would say, one of the biggest battles that we had, I think, the last 2 years. At the OECD level, we stand for one thing, which is a whole of government approach, which means that tourism should be in the table of every ministry involved. And what we've suffered as governments during this period is for more professional, competitive that a tourism board or a tourism minister could be in this point, this was time for health ministries, for transport ministries, for foreign affairs ministries to put rules on the table. And that was a very, very difficult thing. Until now, I think now we're reaching to a point, and I think WHO participation, also European Commission participation on this, saying that travel is not the worst thing that you can do for the pandemic. That helps, but it took 2 years. And this was a very, I would say, very important lesson for the ones that see tourism as a very important industry, which actually for the decision-making process, perhaps it was not that important. There were other things more important to this. So clarification on the rules and some stability on the rules, it's one key element for the future, as I said. Because what we had during this period was what I call the roller coaster. Just to give you an idea, I was on holidays in the Algarve, which is a very UK tourist destination, and the Algarve was full of tourists, and it was Thursday. And the government, the Portuguese government announced, the British government announced that they will close the entrance by Sunday. So after Sunday, you had to do a quarantine to get back to the UK. So everyone from the UK just left the hotel, checked out, and paid 2,000 euros to move to London in a Ryanair flight. So this is impossible for any business. You cannot you cannot have rules changing from one day to the other. And I believe the European Commission played a very important role here over time to stabilizing, to giving up some rules. And now we are reaching to a point where governments are pretty much aligned in terms of lifting restrictions all over Europe and communicating them. We have a website which is Reopen EU. It was a movement that a sign that EU understood the problem that we had on the table, where you can check every country in Europe, what are the measures that are actually in place, because we are one continent, but at the same time, we are one free zone of movement. So moving from one country to the other is an issue for a traveler. And I believe we are now in the direction of being more friendly in terms of communicating with the consumer, which is important. But don't forget businesses. Businesses had to adapt their business from one day to the other. Imagine that you have an hotel full of Brits, and from one day to the other, you're off with customers. It's not an easy thing to manage, and I believe it's one of the most important points, and probably one of the lessons. Destination management requires all these ministries, all these kind of people working together and sitting together, thinking about all the externalities of their decisions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think that leadership is to be very important, and the coordination between different areas, very important. Walanchalee, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned in your presentation the importance of tourism and livelihoods, and there's quite a few questions coming up in the chat. I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at them around that, kind of getting that balance right between low incomes, creating opportunities and livelihoods for people, and this reopening and not kind of creating this over-tourism situation again. Do you have some comments on that, or is that something that you're seeing in Thailand and Asia in terms of particularly around developing countries and opportunities to kind of reorientate the industry in this next new normal?
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think the questions is very important, especially for us in this region, and especially when we have quite a bit of developing nations that rely a lot on tourism. We actually have experienced a lot of mixed feelings when it comes into the tourism industry and the fact based on the COVID-19. On the one hand, as we said, at the moment, this is the time for a lot of recovery, like environmental revival, and a lot of good stuff has been happening. So we tend to really want to keep and maintain these precious and natural resources for a long time. So that's why when it comes to these, we start experiencing the new regulations being changed by the government. Just to give you some example, lately, just at the beginning of this year, Thailand just reopened what we call the Maya Bay once again. So if for anyone who have not heard about Maya Bay, this destination was very famous based on the movie The Beach of the year 2000. And so after the movie, then again, we attract a huge number of tourists, as you could imagine. We during the peak period, one day we could receive about 5,000 tourists within the bay alone, which was like too much for the natural resources to cope with, to cater with. So now when we reopen again, but we have been closing the Maya Bay for 3 years in order to make sure that there was a whole recovery process in our environment and our natural resources. So when we just reopen again, the new regulation was coming up, and now we would allow only 300 tourists arriving into Maya Bay per year, with some limited of activities and some certain regulations in terms of the zone and in terms of the time period. So now, of course, on that side, we're trying to find the regulations in order to maintain the current situation. But then again, as I mentioned before, the tourism industry is a very important pillar, especially for the problems of the poverty elevations. And when we talk about this, we see this a lot in terms of, when we use a community-based tourism, to help stimulate the income for the communities. Now, the problem of COVID-19 has destroyed this, the chance of gaining revenues and affect a lot quite badly to the communities. Now, what happened is in the region, we also have those tourism businesses that we call them tourism social enterprise. And their key role is to use tourism as a key mechanism and tools to reduce the poverty in a lot of communities in the provincial areas, being the country like Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. So these are really important in order to, spread out the income distributions into them areas. Now with the COVID-19 hit, the sad news is we see a lot of these social enterprises, they're being wiped out. They could not sustain. They have the limited resources in terms of getting this funding, in terms of getting the financial resources, and they do not have the ability to build up the capacities. So I think this is one of the key challenges that so many governments in this area, in these regions, have to face in order to try to find more ways to resilience, to build up more resilience and build up the capacities of these people. So yes, and that's why I say that this kind of the mixed feelings are coming up according to the situation we have.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. It's a shame that some of that core infrastructure has kind of faded away over the pandemic, but hopefully we can rebuild that. I'm now going to throw to Jimmy because he has been doing a graphic of our conversation so far, and then I'll come back to the panelists and find out around the research challenges moving forward. So Jimmy, I'll throw to you if you just want to show us your graphic and where you're at in terms of capturing our conversation today.
Sure, not a problem. Just getting it up there now.
Hopefully we've given you lots of ideas and creativity.
There's been plenty to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, fantastic. So we're starting to see some of this sort of conflict in the tourism industry between where we were in the past and where we want to head to moving forward, and definitely the benefit of tourism. And I like the roller coaster, the ups and downs. I think that's just great. All right, I'll let you keep working on it. I am going to throw back to our panelists now, and I might go to Fatima to talk about just one research challenge moving forward. What do you think as researchers, what can we do to help contribute to this next new normal? What's the one challenge you set for us?
As a researcher, I think there are subjects that are related very much to the culture and the diversity of the country. You know, the demography of the UAE is 10% nationals, and the rest are expatriates coming from different parts of the world. However, we managed to put together a very good ecosystem for everybody else to live in peace and in harmony together in the past year, especially the pandemic, where we proved everybody being put together. The further research that I would suggest to go is when we talk about the effect of the pandemic or any crisis like that on mental health, because and also the literacy of using recent technology. I think a lot of us struggled mentally, and mental illness is a bit of a taboo. I know our DHA health regulatory, or probably the ministry itself, they were heavily engaged in trying to open free calls or probably a hotline for people that suffering and struggling. I think also being isolated away from your country and not being able to depart or not being able to return affected people. So maybe that's something could be considered. I'm currently discussing with my supervisors to tweak the research of the legacy impacting youth from the Expo generation program under the Expo, and we are opening a small section that related to their suffering when we really had to sit home and do their learning and internship and legacy and operate within that, especially when they had sick people, also like their grandparents or the death in the family, and also a lot of expatriates who were left isolated here, mentally struggling with a lot of things, let alone the people who lost their job, unfortunately, and they couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I notice in Dubai, there's quite an expatriate population. Does the significance and diversity of the expatriate population influence strategies moving forward?
I'm sorry, Sarah, is that a question?
Yes, that's a question. Yes, yeah.
What is the question?
I just wanted to dive into the expatriate population in Dubai. Has that actually influenced the response to the pandemic, and particularly interested in moving forward, the influence on future strategies?
Oh, wonderful question, Sarah. I think maybe I shouldn't be the one who's talking about it, because I'm very proud Emirati, and everybody you meet here is extremely proud. And I think we also infected a lot of expatriates who came here to have the same pride towards feeling how connected they are to this country. And I can't tell you, but I hear people admiring the leadership, because the leadership care and the healthcare system and the entire proactivity and productivity of the entire system pulled everyone together, and we did not leave someone behind. And with that approach of a government action, I think it's only natural that you pull all these expatriates to feel privileged and to feel part of one community, whether struggling or defending or fighting a pandemic or anything that comes to this land, because they consider it their second home as well. So this is the notion that I really feel like, and I might be strong. I might be strong in my opinion there, but I hope I'm entitled to it.
No, it's been fascinating to see Dubai go from strength to strength. So it's been an interesting an interesting period, but we really have seen that strong leadership come out of that Dubai and the UAE during this period. Pauline, I might turn to you. What's our research challenges, academics and researchers? What challenge do you set out there for us to help with this new normal?
Oh my goodness, so many. Well, you know, the new normal, we have to question that very concept, don't we? You know, I think what we have to start doing as academics is really engaging with the discourse that's happening around the world about new societal structures, new economic structures. We have to start questioning, you know, part of our tourism industry that's driven by capitalism. I think there's so much that we can contribute and learn about how we can bring stakeholders together with collaboration and start creating a new kind of tourism. You know, I'm reading a book right now called Mission Economy, Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. And it's fascinating. And it's this whole idea, you know, when there was the idea to go to the moon from Kennedy, you know, how did that happen? It happened through the collaboration, not just of governments, not just of private sector, not just of community. It was just everybody came together for this moonshot idea. And I think that's what we have to do as researchers, find ways that we can come together, we can create something that is very different from what was. We know that we can't go back to how things were before, but it's going to take a change in mindset by every single stakeholder. And so, you know, that consciousness that has to drive this new normal has to be nurtured, and we have to talk to each other. We have to get ideas across sectors, you know, across all different parts of the economy and society to move forward. So I think researchers in tourism have a huge plate of work ahead of them to move in that direction, and lots of other things.
I love that. So it's sort of that core underpinnings of what tourism was about in the past around profitability and capitalism and so forth. You know, how do we move on from there? That's pretty fundamental to what we offer. Sergio, I just wonder, what's our challenge as researchers and academics?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm in the middle of it. So my background is a little bit mid-academic, mid-industry business, and I make provocations on both sides, to be honest. I think we are in and taking on Pauline was saying, I think we are in a point of transformation of the sector, which I think COVID-19, it was a challenge, but also a huge opportunity and a need for the industry to change. I think we've reached, and I believe if we want to be serious, we were reaching and we were getting in a way which was not a good thing for the society as an industry. So I believe in one statement, which is I believe that tourism is a force for good. But for being a force for good, and we need change metrics. And I believe here researchers have a huge responsibility. Because if we don't change metrics, politicians in the end of the day will be guided by rankings. And rankings are rankings of arrivals, rankings of spending. And if we don't change, if we don't find new metrics of success, how's going to be measuring success of the industry in the future? If it's receipts or if it's arrivals, we will go back to old problems in a nutshell. So here, understanding a little bit, it's a movement that I call it similar to what happened with GDP, that we moved from GDP as the standard for measuring success to beyond GDP and other metrics of quality of life. So I think that's one very important area. A second one, which is also related to this, which is topics of productivity and problems of new business models, because attracting talent means, and I saw some questions here in the chat, and I'll wrap it up like that, which is for changing the business model of the tourism sector and moving from a low wage sector to a more attractive from that point of view sector. We will need to change it, to transform business models and increase productivity of businesses. And here also research plays a very important role, and I come from a business school, and that's one of our priorities here. How can we make our companies stronger so they are able to actually progress in terms of competitiveness?
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, that's really insightful. And then we have Walanchalee.
Actually, yes. No, right.
Yeah,
That's great. You're doing
what are
great,
your
Sarah.
thoughts? What are your thoughts around? I've struggled with your name all day. I did practice a lot before we started, but
No, don't worry.
I haven't got it yet.
No, you're doing great. Thank you. I think I just want to share in terms of research agenda, and for what I would like to propose is pretty much more of the practical research that is suitable for the regions. As I mentioned earlier, that at the moment, I mean, the Thai government are trying to promote more of the movement that attack the climate change. So when it comes into a tourism industry, they start trying to promote the campaigns and look more into how to promote the neutral carbon tourism. And we had a chance to do some research that they're receiving with the government funding. And we investigated the intention of the people, of course, who would like to be more of the responsible tourists and would like to be more of the low carbon tourists. And as you can imagine, when you ask people whether how they agree with, being more environmental friendly with the environment and many other issues, I mean, they tend to agree with that. But then again, we dig deeper to investigate the real behavior of the people. And I can only say based on the Thai context. And in terms of the behavior, we could see that there's a huge discrepancy between the intentions and the real behavior. So if we have to ask tourists to do the carbon offset, if you have to ask tourists for, not cleaning a towel every day at the hotel, I mean, you actually see this huge difference in that. So I think that's actually reflect a lot in terms of the tourist behavior, not only for Thailand, but I assume that it's also applied with, any other tourist behaviors in the region as well. And then it comes into the questions of what kind of research that can help us tackle these issues, what kind of research that can, help us to reduce the discrepancy gap and the intention gap. I think maybe we can apply it with more nudge strategies, including this more into the research, and in order to try that whether when you nudge things in terms of policy levels and in terms of operational levels, which one would work best. So I think we actually need this type of urgent researchers, in our area. And on top of that, another type of research I think would also be very important is relating to how we can help putting recipients into the small tourism business or tourism social enterprises in the area. I think the problem at the moment is we do not have a clear model in terms of creating a good collaborations between public and private partnerships. And so at the moment, of course, we see that a lot of these businesses, they are running individually without having a stronger support in terms of the network. So I think that in terms of the region, we can somehow finding, probably like an appropriate model or the right model that allow these things to work more effectively so that in a way it can, springboard into a positive effect in terms of building up more resilience into these businesses. So that's my thought for now. Thank you.
Yeah, so regenerating our businesses is going to be really important. I am now going to go back to Jimmy because he's been capturing our discussions graphically, and we want to have a look and see what you've come up with, Jimmy. Over to you.
Sorry, the process is a little clunky. It won't be.
We're seeing a blank screen at the moment, but I'm sure they'll be there. While we're waiting for that screen to come up, I know that there's been quite a few questions in the chat and we haven't quite got to all of them. So if the panelists could have a look through those questions, if you could reply to those, or there's things you wanted to add to those questions. My apologies if I haven't got to all the questions. We tried our best. I think we need a longer session for this next time. An hour is not quite enough, but I'll head over to you, Jimmy, and see what you've captured in terms of our discussion today. It looks amazing.
Yeah, no problem. There was quite a wealth of information, so I was trying to keep up. but no, some really interesting stuff coming in from basically definitely not a subject matter expert or anything in this field. It's been great listening to what's going on around the world and hearing some of the feedback. There's obviously quite a few common themes, but also some very sort of different experiences from the different areas. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to capture.
I think you've captured it really well. I love it. I'm going to have to do a big poster of this and put it on my office wall to give me inspiration as to what I'm researching next. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time today. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their contribution today. It's been so interesting having this conversation around next new normal, and also gaining that international perspective. I think a lot of us have been stuck in our own little local bubbles or our neighbourhood bubbles for quite some time. So hopefully we will be travelling internationally again and meeting up at conferences, which will be fantastic. But it's been really great to share your insights. I think it's going to be a really interesting next 12 months and next decade in tourism. I'm quite optimistic for the future. I think the pandemic has been a bit of a disruptor and shaken our tourism industry. But I feel quite hopeful after listening to the panelists today that we can create a really positive next new normal. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm sure everyone's doing some virtual clapping. We really appreciate your time today. And thank you very much. And I will conclude this session. Thank you.
Thank you.